When the Second World War ended, the world expected movement. Troops would return, borders would reopen, prisoners would go home. For millions, that was exactly what happened. But for a small, often forgotten group of German prisoners of war held in Australia, the end of the war raised a question no one had prepared them for. What if going home was no longer the right choice? Exile to the far side of the war, German POWs began arriving in Australia during the early years of the war, starting in 1941. Many had been captured in North Africa after the collapse of the Afrika Korps. Others were taken from German merchant ships, raiders, or submarines intercepted by Allied forces. Their journey was long and disorienting, weeks at sea, unknown destinations, no clear sense of how long captivity would last. Australia was not just far from Germany, it felt like the end of the world, a continent most prisoners knew only as a vague shape on a map associated with heat, emptiness, and British colonial rule. The camps were placed deliberately far from major cities, surrounded by open land rather than walls. Barbed wire cut across red soil and dry grass. Watchtowers stood beneath a southern sky, unfamiliar to European eyes. At first, the prisoners believed this was temporary. They were wrong. Daily life behind the wire, life in Australian POW camps, was controlled, regimented, and monotonous. But compared to many other camps worldwide, it was also relatively humane. Prisoners were required to work. They harvested crops, repaired roads, cleared land, and helped sustain the agricultural economy. The work was physically demanding, but it was real labor with visible results. Food was basic, but regular. Medical care existed. Discipline was enforced, but systematic brutality was rare. This mattered more than anyone expected. As reports slowly reached the camps describing bombed German cities, mass displacement, starvation, and the collapse of infrastructure, an uncomfortable realization began to spread. Behind barbed wire in Australia, many prisoners were safer than civilians in Germany. The collapse of certainty. Years of Nazi propaganda had portrayed the Allies as cruel, vengeful enemies. Australia, in particular, was depicted as a distant colonial outpost, hostile to Germans. Reality did not match the narrative. God spoke to prisoners without hatred. Some showed curiosity, others showed indifference. Farmers thanked POWs for their work. In rural areas, interactions with civilians were limited but often respectful. In camps such as Cowra, these contradictions became impossible to ignore. If the enemy was not what they had been told, then what else had been false? For many prisoners, this realization caused a quiet but profound ideological collapse. The war had not only destroyed cities, it had destroyed certainty. The war ends, and fear replaces hope. In 1945, news of Germany's surrender reached the camps. There were celebrations, there were tears, there was silence. Repatriation was announced soon afterward. At first, it sounded like salvation. Then letters arrived. Families were missing. Homes were gone. Entire neighborhoods no longer existed. Germany was occupied, divided, and struggling to feed its population. Returning meant facing scarcity, political uncertainty, and moral reckoning. For men who had spent years adjusting to a stable, if restricted, life in Australia, the idea of return no longer felt comforting. Australia had been untouched by bombing. Its economy was intact. Its need for labor was growing. The contrast was stark. The unspoken question. At first, no one said it out loud. Then someone did. What if we stayed? The idea was dangerous. Refusing repatriation could be interpreted as disloyalty, cowardice, or ideological betrayal. It invited scrutiny from Australian authorities and suspicion from fellow Germans. But slowly, the idea took hold. Not everyone wanted to remain. Most POWs still chose to return home, despite everything. But a smaller group had changed too much to believe that returning meant starting over. Australia represented something unfamiliar. A life without constant political pressure, without collective guilt imposed from every direction, without ruins as daily reminders. Staying was not about comfort. It was about possibility. From captives to citizens, the process of remaining in Australia was long and cautious. Authorities investigated motivations carefully. Backgrounds were reviewed. Political affiliations were examined. But Australia faced a labor shortage in the post-war years. Farms needed workers. Infrastructure needed rebuilding. And these men already knew the land, the climate, and the work. Local employers quietly supported them. Farmers wrote letters. Community leaders vouched for individuals they trusted. Gradually, permissions were granted. Former prisoners were released not onto ships bound for Europe, but into Australian society. They became immigrants, building new lives. Life after captivity was not easy. Many former POWs struggled with identity. They spoke German at home and English in public. Some changed their names to blend in. Others kept them, accepting the quiet distance it created. They married. They worked. They raised children who spoke with Australian accents. Most avoided speaking about the war. Silence became a form of survival, a way to move forward without reopening wounds. When asked why they stayed, their answers were never dramatic. Because I could start again. Because I was treated fairly. Because no one told me who I had to be. A different ending to the war. History often divides the world into winners and losers. But these stories exist between those categories. German POWs who remained in Australia did not deny their past. They accepted it and chose a different future. They arrived as enemies, lived as prisoners, and stayed as neighbors. They refused to go home. And in doing so, they revealed a quiet truth. Sometimes, the end of a war is not about return. It is about choosing where and how to live next. Staying did not feel like freedom, at least not at first. When the former German prisoners of war were released into civilian life in Australia, there was no clear moment of transformation. No symbolic crossing from captivity to belonging. Freedom arrived fragmented, in paperwork, in temporary work contracts, in unfamiliar expectations. Many of them still woke before dawn, long after barbed wire had disappeared from their lives. Habits formed in captivity refused to loosen their grip. Time was still measured carefully. Food was still eaten quickly. Silence still felt safer than conversation. They were free men who did not yet know how to live freely, learning how to exist again. Work became the first bridge. Australia, in the late 1940s and 1950s, needed labor, urgently. Farms expanded, railways stretched deeper into the continent. Construction projects multiplied as cities grew. Former POWs filled those gaps. They worked where conditions were harsh and pay was modest, in places few Australians wanted to go. The irony was not lost on them. Isolation felt familiar. Physical labor made sense. At first, they were the Germans. Then they were the blokes who work hard. Eventually, They were simply the men from down the road. Acceptance did not come through sympathy. It came through reliability, language, names, and quiet adaptation. Language was one of the hardest barriers. Many learned English slowly, imperfectly. Accents never fully disappeared. Grammar remained uneven, but communication was possible, and that was enough. Some changed their names. Wilhelm became William. Hans became John. Karl became Charles. Others refused, keeping their German names as a quiet act of honesty. Both choices carried consequences. In public, they spoke English. At home, German lingered, softer, slower, fading with each generation. Relationships and families. Romantic relationships were complicated. Some Australians were suspicious, others were indifferent. A few were curious. Over time, marriages happened quietly, without spectacle. Children followed. For these children, the war existed only as fragments, a photograph in a drawer, an accent at the dinner table, a silence when certain questions were asked. Many former POWs avoided discussing their past directly, not because they denied it, but because they feared how it would be understood. The war was too complex to explain simply. Guilt was too personal to share publicly. Silence became protection for themselves and for their families. Memory without monuments. Unlike veterans, former POWs had no official place in national memory. They did not march in parades. They did not wear medals. They did not tell heroic stories. Their presence existed quietly, often unnoticed. Former campsites were dismantled or repurposed. Some became farmland. Others became industrial zones. Only a few were marked with memorials, and even those were understated. Memory, like belonging, was subtle. Encounters with the past decades later, many faced a choice they never expected to consider again. Return to Germany, not to live, but to see. Some went back. They found cities rebuilt beyond recognition, streets cleaner, buildings taller, a country transformed by time and reckoning. For many, there was relief and distance. They were visitors, not returnees. Germany felt familiar, but no longer intimate. Australia, with all its imperfections, felt earned. Others never went back at all. The distance had become part of who they were. From outsiders to witnesses, as time passed, historians began asking questions that society had not asked before. What happened to the prisoners after the war? Why did some stay? What did captivity look like far from the front lines? Former POWs were invited, cautiously, to speak. Some refused, others agreed, carefully choosing their words. They spoke not to defend the past, but to explain the conditions that shaped their choices. They described boredom, labor, human treatment, ideological collapse. They spoke about realizing that enemies were not always monstrous, and that systems mattered more than slogans. Their stories complicated simple narratives that made them valuable. Old age and final belonging. By the late 20th century, most of these men were elderly. They lived modest lives, suburban houses, small farms, quiet routines. Their children and grandchildren were fully Australian, culturally, linguistically, socially. At community events, they were no longer introduced as former prisoners. They were neighbors, grandfathers, retirees. When they died, funerals were small and private. Gravestones bore German names under Australian soil, dates that spanned continents and ideologies. Their final resting place said everything, what their choice meant. History often treats the end of war as a return to borders, return to flags, return to national identity. But these men showed another possibility, that sometimes the end of war is not about going back, it is about choosing forward. They refused to go home, not because they rejected Germany, but because they had discovered a different way to exist, one without constant command, without ideological pressure, without inherited hatred. They arrived as enemies. They lived as prisoners. They stayed as citizens. And in doing so, they left behind a quiet legacy, not of victory or defeat, but of choice. Before they refused to go home, before they were prisoners, they were ordinary men. Most of them did not leave Germany dreaming of conquest or glory. They left because it was expected, because refusal was dangerous, because the uniform came with consequences, whether you wore it willingly or not. They were sons, apprentices, farmers, mechanics, students. Some believed what they were told. Others learned to stay quiet early. By the time the war reached its full scale, silence had become a skill. When orders came, they followed. Not all of them understood where they were going. Few understood why. They fought far from home, in the deserts of North Africa, on merchant ships crossing dangerous waters, on submarines that disappeared for weeks beneath the surface. The war they experienced was not the one described in speeches. It was hunger, boredom, fear, and waiting. Waiting for something to happen. Waiting for it to end. Capture, when it came, was often sudden. A disabled ship, a surrounded unit, a decision made by someone else. For many, surrender felt less like defeat and more like relief. The journey into captivity was long. Weeks at sea under guard, uncertainty about destination, rumors spreading faster than facts. Some believed they would be sent to Britain. Others expected Canada. Very few had heard of Australia. Those who had imagined it as a distant colony, harsh and unforgiving, a place where prisoners would disappear and be forgotten. In a sense, they were right. Arrival was disorienting. The sky looked wrong. The seasons were reversed. The land felt open in a way that made hiding impossible. They stepped off ships into heat and silence, escorted inland to camps placed deliberately far from cities. Barbed wire stretched across landscapes that seemed endless. At first, they believed this was temporary, that the war would end soon, that they would return home. That captivity was merely a pause. They continued to think of themselves as visitors in time. Inside the camps, hierarchy persisted. Some prisoners clung to ideology, enforcing discipline among their own. Others withdrew completely. Quiet resistance took many forms, refusing enthusiasm, avoiding slogans, focusing only on survival. Work assignments broke old structures. On farms, in fields, on roads, ranks mattered less than effort. Skill replaced status. A man who could fix a machine or handle livestock gained respect faster than one who repeated speeches. This shift was subtle, but irreversible. Letters from home arrived slowly. At first, they carried reassurance, then worry, then absence. Families disappeared from addresses. Cities became names, followed by silence. The world they imagined returning to began to dissolve while they remained alive and fed behind wire. The realization arrived gradually, and it was unsettling. Time was moving differently for them than for Germany. Australia was not kind in the way propaganda had warned against. It was indifferent. And in that indifference, some men felt something they had not felt in years. Space. No rallies. No slogans. no constant demand to believe, just work, routine, days that passed without ideology attached to them. They did not yet know it, but this was the beginning, not of freedom, of distance. When the war finally ended, the question was no longer, when do we go home? It was, what exactly is home now? That question would shape the rest of their lives and lead to a decision history rarely talks about: the decision to stay.